All right, folks, really glad to have everyone here as we're dealing with the first half of a cooler and wetter March. Can't be happier than that. Taking a look from March 1st to March 16th, you're seeing the colder temperatures and the greater amounts of precipitation. You know, when we're thinking about March having precipitation, it's usually one of our drier months, but last March we had some precipitation, and even last April we ended up having some snow. So happy to have it. You can see most of the locations around the state from the systems that we've had already in here in March have gotten some good precipitation, but not everyone. You can see that Page really didn't get measurable precipitation. Cochise County, a little dry. And really sorry that Western Mojave County didn't get much precipitation, but otherwise pretty good to have that precipitation in March. We're going to go ahead and get started about talking about what happened for February, kind of reviewing what happened there, giving you the stats on everything. Really in February, we only had one measurable event, and that was great, but there wasn't much else. So there wasn't much else to cool us off. You can see the temperatures were fairly extreme in February. A lot of stations had their hottest February on record. And that was like Williams, Show Low, Pine. Those had some of their record hottest temperatures. We were dealing with a really strong ridge at the start of February, and that set those high temperatures in places like Winslow, Tucson, and Safford for the daily hottest temperatures. And then after the storm system, kind of mid-February, another ridge set up, and we had another round of high temperature records like in Belmont. Phoenix hit 90 degrees on February 25th. Phoenix Phoenix has had 90 degrees before in February, but it doesn't happen all that often. So if you start looking at the record since 1896, this was the fourth time that Phoenix hit 90 degrees in February. And now looking at the precipitation for February, the one February system that brought measurable precipitation, it happened mid-February. So it was February 13th through the 15th. It brought decent snow in Flagstaff, a bit over 5 inches. Tempe had 5/100ths of an inch of rain. Tucson had 15/100ths of an inch of rain. Yuma had no measurable precipitation in February. Actually, that's not hugely unusual. So when we're looking at these county numbers, most of the numbers for the county, they've happened before. We've had drier Februaries before. You can see Maricopa County has had its 12th driest February. Greenlee, Pinal, Santa Cruz, those counties had their 10th driest February. Pima County had their 8th driest February. It was a tough month. So now looking at the water year. So remember, water year is how we measure precipitation. It starts October 1st, goes through September 30th. So if we pop back into October last year, remember, we had been dealing with a record-breaking heat wave from September to October. And really, that brought Arizona its hottest October on record. So then it was also fairly dry. November, though, changed a little bit. It was dry, but it started cooling off. December got really hot again, and it ended up being the second hottest and second driest December on record for the state. January cooled off, but January was the fifth driest January on record for the state. So adding in what happened in February, the second hottest February, 20th driest February, that brings the water year as the sixth warmest and the third driest October to February on record statewide. And if you look at the map, you can see that many weather stations, and so kind of west, central, southern, they've not gotten a lot of precipitation October to February. They're staying in their lowest 10 water year rankings at this time. So just like October to January, when we looked at it last month, it's got that same 23% of long-term precipitation. That's where we land now with October to February, 23% of long-term precipitation. And that looks like there's a lot to make up, even though, March, April, May, June. We're moving into the driest months of the year. Remember, we do like to have a wet monsoon, but we start thinking about these things right now. But if we have too much water too quickly in the summer, that causes flash flooding. So considering these kinds of situations, it's important to remember Arizona statistically has 4 flash flood fatalities annually. So things to consider. Now, we're thrilled to have a wet March this year. And for Arizona, kind of looking at the snow water equivalent, so how much is measured in the various different basins, we can kind of take a look at a year that was very similar to what we've been experiencing right now, and that was 2006. 2006, that was the driest December to February on record for the state. And this year, 2025, the second driest December to February on record. 2006, really, really dry, but also ended up being wet in March for the state. And really that helped 2006 end as the ninth driest December to March on record. So still low, but better than being the driest. And so hopefully our March this year is going to help 2025. If we look at the upper Colorado Basin, they've been doing okay. And we know that the storms in winter are really moving into that northern tier from the La Nina event that we've been experiencing. So that's not unusual, and it's playing out what we're seeing in the upper Colorado Basin. So the median peak for the upper Colorado Basin, it's still coming. So that's usually around the start of April. While the lower Colorado Basin, that's us, has been really dry this winter, that one large February storm and the last few March storms, you can see them pop up a little bit higher. And so when we're looking at that those last March events really popped us into the 70% of median for March. But it's important to remember, March is still a very low amount of precipitation. Just need to give that perspective when we're looking at those numbers. Another thing to consider is looking at soil moisture. So, that soil moisture at this time of year, it's a factor of where that snow is going to go. So given that our antecedent soil moisture conditions across the state last fall, very, very dry, the runoff efficiencies for the snowmelt is really expected to be lower than average. What that means is when snow starts melting, March and April, it's that the snow wants to first go into the soil as opposed to going into the water supply. So it's a consideration. We look at the northwest upper Colorado Basin, soil moisture conditions slightly below average. Southwest Colorado soil moisture conditions, better. We're closer to average. They had a wet summer last year. So that really helps the model outlook show that Lake Powell should have about 70% of the normal amounts from the expected snowmelt. Now looking here at the U.S. drought map, in Arizona, we refer to this map as the short-term drought map because it's more aligned to short-term conditions, mostly for a few months, maybe a year. Last year, let's pop back into last winter. Last winter, especially January to April, above average precipitation for the state. So that improved much of our short-term drought across the state then. And then a wetter June, even though it's a dry June statistically, we had more precipitation than we would normally get in June. And so that actually helped delay some of the expansion of short-term drought. So even though by the end of the monsoon, with those extreme conditions in September and October, short-term drought, that's when it started expanding. And it started expanding first in western counties, then central, then it started moving into southeastern counties. Arizona really saw a large expansion of extreme short-term drought last month, and then exceptional drought really started moving into central Arizona this month. The short-term drought map that was released this month is roughly the same that we saw at the start of March. Now here we go looking at what might happen at the end of March. Looks like we might be warmer and drier. I think it's important to consider that when we get a lot of precipitation, that really does help with building vegetation. So those grasses, brush, those fine fuel vegetation that can build. We need to pay attention to what's going on with the potential for wildfire outlook, especially looking at above normal conditions for Arizona, especially southeast, so Cochise County, eastern Arizona, looking at those outlooks April and May above normal for wildfire activity. Just a reminder here is to kind of an overview for the state, kind of above, below, looking at those long-term averages, kind of how we've been dealing with these conditions for winter and for summer. So here we are, we had a dry summer 2024. This is a dry winter 2025. We're all concerned and considering what may happen in summer. And this was just released today, which shows that we're going to be potentially, for the outlook from the CPC, above normal temperatures for July, August, September. Not surprised to see that, but kind of surprised to see the green showing up for above normal precipitation for July, August, and September. Always thrilled to see that, but with a grain of salt, we have to pay attention to how that starts to look. The last time I saw these happen, though, with the CPC outlook, it was 2022. They started saying in May that we would have a really wet summer, and it actually came out to be accurate. So we'll pay attention to this. We'll keep paying attention to this. You can never stop looking at these ideas, but we're very, very hopeful we'll have a wetter than normal summer. And I'm grateful now to introduce our guest speaker, and really happy to have Bo here as the meteorologist, principal climate scientist for the Salt River Projects, to give us a good idea about what's going to happen in central Arizona. And I'll let you go ahead and share screen, Bo, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, here I go, sharing screen. Thank you, Aaron. Happy to be here. So I'm hoping everybody can see the full slide mode right now.
Looks great.
Of my presentation. Okay, so I'll be talking about SRP's water supply and how it's fared through so far in winter 2025. And definitely Aaron teed up some things nicely for me. So I've advanced now to the outline slide. So I'll be talking about the Salt and the Verde river basins and give a quick overview of the Salt River Project. I'll talk about the historically dry October to February. And I'm glad Aaron mentioned Marches typically being dry. We had the third consecutive wet March. So I'll talk about that and maybe add a little bit to what Aaron said. I'll talk about current reservoir storage and future reservoir storage. Where did all that precipitation we saw in the last 2 weeks go? So this is an image of the areas of concern for the Salt River Project. The Salt River Project manages 6 reservoirs on the Salt and the Verde watersheds and 1 reservoir on East Clear Creek watershed. So the Salt Reservoir, the Salt watershed extends east of the Phoenix metropolitan area, which is in the lower left-hand corner of this map, and it extends out to New Mexico almost. And then the Verde River watershed extends almost up to the Grand Canyon to the north. And C.C. Craigan Dam is a dam on a portion of the East Clear Creek watershed that's on top of the Mogollon Rim there, drains into Little Colorado. That's an important dam for water supply of northern Gila County. So we operate reservoirs that store a big chunk of the valley's water supply. In fact, if you include the groundwater that we conjunctively manage with the surface water in the ground and the reservoirs, we are the single largest provider of water to the Phoenix metropolitan area and the agricultural lands outside of it. It's not just the Colorado River that's important, although it is very important. I think that's about all to say on this slide. I'll show this map again with pictures of where snow should be, especially considering that we just had a wet early March. Okay, so this is the accumulating precipitation through the water year over the drainage basins that you saw on the previous slide. So the Salt and the Verde watersheds. And the green line is what's happened this water year since October 1st. The dashed green line is last water year, and the red line is normal. So you could see confirmation with what Aaron said, not surprisingly, with the Salt and the Verde watersheds being a big chunk of Arizona. Things got really dry after the first week of November. And by the time we got to end of February, it was basically the second or third driest winter, November through February on record. And then March happened, and it's already above average March. We don't have to have any more rainfall or snowfall. And that's the third consecutive wet March. And the reason why I bring that up is because, like Aaron said, Marches have tended to be dry, but only recently. And it seems like it's kind of a hallmark of this mega drought we're in, is that Marches are dry. Whereas in the late 1970s to the early 1990s, Marches were not dry. They were often quite wet. And as a matter of fact, I haven't read the paper yet, but I happened to come across a peer-reviewed paper talking about why that Marches being dry are indeed a signature of this current drought, and Marches were tended to be very active with precipitation during the last pluvial, the late 70s to the early 80s or early 90s. And they tied it back to La Nina, which, kind of just doesn't make it that surprising. However, at least people are acknowledging that this wet March, dry March thing seems to be one of the things that stands out greatly with the difference between a drought and a pluvial. So I guess that's some good news coming off of a really dry winter. All right. So where do the reservoirs stand? So they're actually the reservoir storage for SRP. Here's all the reservoirs as represented by their percentage of full. And you could see up in the top of this graphic that the whole reservoir system is 70% full. And I'll put that into the context in more detail later. But that's pretty good considering that we've had two very hot and dry summers the last two monsoon seasons, and then now we're having a very dry winter. So that's a good situation to be in. I'll talk about why we're that high in a few slides from now. I think the thing to point out, though, the thing that really screams at me about this being a dry winter, though, on this graphic is C.C. Craigan Dam up there north of Payson. That's called Blue Ridge Reservoir. It used to be, if you're familiar, and it can fill up really easily with a few winter storms. So the fact that it's still only 22% full shows that there's basically been no runoff this winter. But we just had a wet March, so let's see what happens. What about the future? Okay, so the future. We've already talked about how it rained and snowed a bunch in the first bit of March. And this is a graphic of SRP's stream flow projections. We usually do our stream flow projections January through May. And on March 1st, before the storms, we were projecting 108,000 acre feet of runoff January through May total. An acre foot would be like a football field in area, 1 foot deep. It's 325,000 gallons. But 108,000 acre feet is basically close to the driest on record in terms of our runoff season. So that's what we were forecasting on March 1st. We knew some wetter weather was coming, and we got more wet weather than we expected. And we just met a few days ago to update our forecast, and we're actually going to lower it. We're going to make it even closer to the driest on record, even though we got a wet March. So what the heck is that all about, right? Here's what's going on. much like 2006, like Aaron said, super dry, wet March, lots of snow. But here's what the typically snow-covered areas throughout the winter, here's what they look like now. Even though snow piled up across the state, a lot of it's already ablated away. So Aaron showed that graphic of relative to the median for mid-March in the lower Colorado River Basin, the snowpack was looking good. But the catch is that that snowpack that Aaron showed in her line plots of the snow water equivalent, that's kind of like distributed across a large area. And it's not confined to a bunch of really deep snow areas that have been favored and not melting yet. It's spread out over the watershed from the recent storms in areas that are going to melt out really fast. And that's what you see here is we've already melted out a lot of the snow that we had just a week ago. And we didn't see any response from that rainfall or snowfall in the rivers to speak of. So here's a cool little tidbit comparing the runoff production this March compared to March 2023, which was also wet. So far in March, the Salton and the Verde watersheds have gotten 2.3 inches of precipitation averaged across the basins. The additional stream flow that we've seen from that rainfall and melted snow is 3,000 acre feet. Okay. Maybe that sounds like a lot, maybe it doesn't, but in the two big storms in March 2023, we got a similar amount of precipitation, and the immediate runoff from rainfall from those storms was not 3,000 acre feet, it was 686,000 acre feet. So it just shows the difference between dry antecedent conditions, like the driest you can think of right now, where that rain and snow melt and rainfall went right into the soils in this case, versus wet antecedent conditions like in March 2023, when a lot of that rainfall wasn't able to go into the soils because the soils were full of water and it very efficiently flowed downhill into the reservoirs. So dramatic difference between a wet March this year versus a wet March in 2023. 686,000 acre feet of rainfall generated inflow in March 2023 and only 3,000 this year. So it's like night and day, all about the dry antecedent conditions. So this is a plot of how storage on SRP's reservoir system has evolved since the beginning of water year 2023. The gray shading is an envelope of where the reservoir system has been historically in terms of storage. You could see maximum, minimums, 10th percentiles, medians, and 90th percentiles on the quartiles. And at the end of March, or the end of March of 2023, we got to our highest storage ever. And the reason why that red line there is above the envelope is because the envelope is smoothed. For clarity, you're just gonna have to trust me that indeed, at the end of March 2023, we got to the highest storage ever. And then in 2024, we had another wet winter. And that's the reason why, despite the dry and hot summers, we are above median for storage right now, is because of those two great winters we had recently. They're still, their fingerprints still on the situation, even though we've had hot and dry summers and a dry winter right now. So what would it take? What would it take for storage to get this low again? That's the minimum. That happened in 2002. And that's when SRP reduced allocations to our customers. So what would it take to get that low again? I think that's an interesting question, considering we have a winter this dry and summer that hot and dry previously. Well, if we had another hot and dry summer like last summer, we would tank in the storage like you see there from 2024. And then if we had another dry winter and then another hot and dry summer like 2024, so 3 more extremely dry seasons, we still probably wouldn't be that low if you just eyeball the distances there. And another reason why we wouldn't be that low is we would start pumping more groundwater that really we haven't been pumping because our storage has been so high the last 2 years. So even though things have been dry for the last 11 months, we need a lot more dry weather to get to historically low storage on the reservoir system. So yeah, in summary, the wet early March was certainly great for the fire season, like Aaron mentioned. I imagine that at least delayed things by a month for the pine forest fire season. Could you imagine what it would have been like if we just stayed hot and dry like we were in February and March? We probably would have already been looking at some fire danger right now. So it's great that the March happened. It just didn't do much for runoff into our reservoirs. But our reservoirs are above average still due to the previous 2 wet winters. That's all I have. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
That was an excellent presentation, Bo. Thank you so much.
No problem.